Almost 40,000 Oregonians live in Lake Oswego, and less than 1% of them are Black.
If you're not a player for the Blazers, you kind of feel like an alien.
So we asked the less than 1% what their experience is like. You had a lot to say about my interview with a police officer on crowd control tactics at Portland's protests.
Those same people are the ones throwing rocks and bottles.
That it can't be a blanket truth that's applied to the logic of this. And I'm sure you'll have a lot more to say after we share part 2 tonight.
I'm Jim Bognett.
He's running for office in Pennsylvania.
Good evening, Portland.
So why the heck is he running ads here?
I've heard you've been having a few issues.
Here's the story. Nothing about 2020 is normal, so why not, right? I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story. Dan, in case you haven't heard, is getting some solid R&R this week. And actually, a viewer named Harriet wrote in saying that she misses, quote, his sweet face. His sweet face. That was so precious. I loved that email. And Harriet, I promise that we'll pass it along. And by the way, for those who are on hashtag Team Harriet, which I'm hoping to make a thing, fear not, Dan is back on Friday. Until then, though, you guys are stuck with me. And we want to hear from you. So email the story at kgw.com. You can reach out on Twitter with the hashtag HeyDan. That never changes. Or you can message Dan or me on Facebook. We have a team watching those channels right now. And as always, we're listening. So with that, let's start the show. And I frankly don't want to wait any longer before jumping into tonight's big story because it is an eye-opening one and it might benefit from a little bit of background. So let's back up here. You might remember a couple of weeks ago when Lake Oswego found itself trending on Twitter across the country. A family had posted a sign in their window, that sign, supporting Black Lives Matter. Then they got a letter from an anonymous neighbor asking them to take the sign down. The letter said the sign was bringing down property values on that street. For reference, less than 1% of Lake Oswego's population is Black. That's less than 400 people. And this week, our own Bryant Clerkley talked with some of the less than 1% about what it's like living in a predominantly white town. And suffice it to say, they didn't hold back.
If you're not a player for the Blazers, you kind of feel like an alien. You know, people who are not people of color or not African American, they kind of want to know, what are you doing here? You know, are you new here? You know, do you own a house here? Do you work here? And it's kind of uncomfortable because you feel as if people are probing you as if you don't deserve to live in that neighborhood or in this community.
Justice Rogers came to LO from Southern California. It's his fiance's hometown. U.S. Census numbers show in Lake Oswego less than 1% of the population is Black. That translates to about 300 people out of the 40,000 people living here.
As a Black man, I'm living in an area like Lake Oswego. You know, there are certain things that other people can do that I can't do. Like, I can't go jogging at night. You know, I can't wear a hood over my head, if it's dark or the sun's going down, because now people are thinking you're suspicious. I have to be very vocal and open when I walk into, a convenience store so that people are aware that I'm not here to rob the place.
Willie Poinsett has lived in Lake Oswego more than 30 years. She raised a son here and is one of the founders of the group Respond to Racism in LO. It formed 3 years ago to get people together to talk about the topic. The letter sent to a family with a sign in support of the Black Lives Matter movement highlights the need for more conversation.
The letter that brought Lake Oswego to the front again is just something that we're dealing with. This is all kinds of things that may happen, but we're steady. We're saying, not in the city. We're not going to just let it go.
People of color in LO, she says, are sometimes treated with suspicion.
Sometimes they're curious and sometimes they're scared. Okay, all right? I want to be quite honest. They're scared, so they wondered whether or not you're going to come and rob their house, or why are you walking around?
A documentary which features Poinsett gives the history of exclusion in Lake Oswego and the state of Oregon. It points out a time when Blacks were not allowed to live in the city.
And so this town was a little town that rich doctors and lawyers and people had their little summer cottages here. And they would have Black people come and do domestic work and, those kinds of things. But by sundown, you had to be out of this town.
Poinsett and Rogers say while that history is still felt today, there's an effort to make the city more inclusive, and there's a hope more people of color will make it home.
I encourage it because that's the only way that people are going to get comfortable is the more they get to interact with people of color, with Black people, with African American people, is when they're around you. And I think some people are possibly unknowingly ignorant. They don't want to be that way, but just because they're not too familiar with the culture and things like that.
All right, Bryant Clerkley is joining us now. And Bryant, you and I talked on the phone, and I told you, and we've been talking about it in the newsroom, I think your story was so well done, and it's so important. And you told some of our colleagues that you had never done a story like this, right?
Yeah, Maggie, that's right. A story focusing on sort of the microaggressions that people of color get every day is unlike anything I've ever done. Most of the time, I feel in my career when I've done stories focused on the Black community, it has something to do with crime. But this had nothing to really do with crime. It was just about living in a place, existing as a person of color, and the issues that we face sometimes. So I actually got to take a deep dive into people's lives that live in a community that I didn't really know that much about before I started researching it. And everything sort of came together like that. So yeah, this was definitely a new topic for me.
Yeah, well, we're so glad that you dove into it. And you just kind of touched on it. You are new to KGW and new to the Portland market. For those who are sitting at home and they're wondering, who's this guy? This is Bryant Clerkley. He's one of our newest reporters. You started here, you told me June 1st, came across the country from Florida, and we're so glad you're here. I want to make sure people at home know, when a reporter lands, and we've all done it, when you land in a new market, it's really hard to find stories and to find sources. So I'm curious how you found the voices that you did for this story, and then what was their reaction to being asked to talk about the Black experience in Lake Oswego? What did they think of that?
Yeah, the voice, you're right. It is very difficult to find voices and find sources and connections when you first move to a new city. So I did some social media research. So once the story about the anonymous letter was posted on our Twitter page, the anonymous letter that the family got about their sign supporting Black Lives Matter, one of the people in my story, Justice, he was really opinionated on that and was commenting. So I just sent him a message on Twitter, and that's how I found him. And he was really excited about doing the interview because we don't cover a lot of stories, or, he has not seen a lot of stories about microaggressions or the things that he faces as a Black man on an everyday basis. And then Willie Poinsett, she has a group called Respond to Racism in LO, and they have an Instagram page. And that is how I got in touch with her. And like Justice, she was very happy to do the story because, she doesn't feel like her voice has been amplified over the past 30 years she's lived in Lake Oswego. And she had a lot to say about her experiences.
Yeah, they definitely did. Well, Bryant, thank you again so much. We think this story was really valuable, really important. Great job, man. I'm just so excited that you're here and you're doing the work that you're doing. So Bryant Clerkley, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I really appreciate it.
Big fan of his. That's awesome. All right, moving on tonight, two massive developments to tell you about in the ongoing saga of the United States Postal Service. First, attorneys general across America, including Ellen Rosenblum in Oregon and Bob Ferguson in Washington, announced a lawsuit to challenge recent changes to USPS. Changes like cutting staff overtime and removing mail sorting machines and even removing mailboxes in some states, including, as you might have seen, dozens in Oregon. The second development, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy announced all of those changes aren't going to happen. DeJoy was a Trump campaign mega donor before he was asked to lead the Postal Service in mid-June. In today's announcement, he said, quote, "To avoid even the appearance of any impact on election mail, I am suspending these initiatives until after the election is concluded." DeJoy claims the changes were just cost-saving measures, but many worried it was an attempt to derail mail-in voting ahead of the November election, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
I don't frankly trust the Postmaster General and what he said, and if he's sincere about it, it means the bully has backed off.
So President Trump has repeatedly attacked mail-in voting, saying with no evidence that it's rife with fraud. Oregon's and Washington's Republican secretaries of state say straight up it's not. Since last week, President Trump has threatened to withhold funding to the Postal Service because of mail-in voting, going so far as to say if the country does universal mail-in voting, quote, "It'll end up being a rigged election or they will never come out with an outcome. They'll have to do it again, and nobody wants that."
When the story continues, more of my interview with a Portland police officer on the front lines of the protests and his take on the DA's new rules about prosecuting people arrested there.
They're going to know that they can get away with a certain amount of vandalism, potentially assaults on officers.
A viewer wants to know if Portland police really missed more than 60 911 calls over the weekend. And why is a candidate for Congress in Pennsylvania advertising on Portland airwaves?
We won't tolerate any of that horse around here.
Welcome back, everybody, to the story, I should say. I'm Maggie Vespa. I'm in for Dan this week, despite that flub. Thanks to everyone who's writing in using the hashtag HeyDan and emailing the story at kgw.com. We read everything. In case in point, I want to read an email from a viewer named Karen now. She wrote in, quote, "I got a text from a relative across the country this evening asking, what's up with 61 unanswered 911 calls to Portland police over the weekend? Is there a problem with 911 calls to Portland police going unanswered?" Karen, thank you so much for the question. So let's start with whether your relative's information is correct. Here's the backstory. After Saturday night's protest, Portland police put out a press release and it went into detail about how many people they arrested and why. And that's pretty common. Then at the end, police wrote this: "At the time of this release, over 60 calls for police service were holding around the city. Some had been holding for the length of the events described here," meaning the lengths of the protests. This release came out around 4 a.m. on Sunday. Then, shortly after that, Fox News picked that up and put the information in their headlines. So I'm willing to bet that's how your relative across the country learned about it, unless they subscribed to emails from Portland police. And for what it's worth, police said there are a number of reasons why they're stretched so thin on dispatch lines. They cited the protests. They also cited a number of pre-planned retirements this month, and the Bureau has been dealing with staffing shortages for years. So we hope that helps clear some of that up. And that brings me to our next story. My interview with Portland Police Sergeant Brent Maxey, an 18-year veteran of the force who's been at the nearly 3 months of protests most nights. His full interview is up on YouTube right now. We aired portions of it last night. And the feedback, man, it came like a tidal wave. On the YouTube video, Kilowatts, actual name on YouTube, wrote, quote, "Very disappointing, KGW. The bias is unreal. I support you and your brothers, Sergeant Brent Maxey." Carol Mitchell wrote, "How could this reporter come out against someone who volunteered to speak? Did she use this to make her police force look bad?" Chuck Holton wrote, "Cute how she is pretending to be a journalist." Wowza. All right, really quick, I've never heard male reporters called cute, but I digress. All right, look, I'm always kind of struck when we as journalists press, or to kind of use a cheesy word, grill a source, and then the public reacts with more venom than the source themselves. And by that, I mean Sergeant Maxey and I talked for an hour and 15 minutes with a spokesperson for the Bureau standing off to the side. You can see him in part of the video. And as you see, he answered every single question in a composed and thoughtful manner. And it shocks me that I have to say this, but me playing the devil's advocate, asking questions of a publicly paid city employee, let alone one that is tasked with maintaining our public safety, isn't me showing my bias or even me stating my point of view. It's me doing my job. We press sources, presenting the opposing viewpoints, vetting their answers, and pointing out logical holes when we hear them, and then we let them respond. That's what an interview is. I hope that's what people would want from their journalists. Regardless, it's what we'll continue to do. So with that, let's air some more. Night number 2. Let's do it. Tonight, I want to zero in on Sergeant Maxey's views on Multnomah County's new district attorney, Mike Schmidt. There's his answer there, or rather, the sergeant's views on Schmidt's new policy. Last week, the new DA announced he would not prosecute a lot of the lower level crimes we see tied to arrests at these protests. Things like disorderly conduct, interfering with a peace officer, even riot in some cases. He said he would absolutely prosecute violent ones like arson, assault, etc. So we shot this interview, the one that's causing so much chaos on YouTube, with Sergeant Maxey a week ago today, the same day that policy was announced. Can you give me your reaction to that?
I was, how do I put this? I was going to say I was surprised, but I think it's dangerous in that if you, I think it's going to have the effect of emboldening people to do more during these events. They are going to know that when we declare a riot, it means nothing. They're going to know that they can get away with a certain amount of vandalism, potentially assaults on officers, resisting arrest without facing any consequences other than, they can still be arrested. And actually the direction from the chief is that we will still make those arrests. And but the fact of the matter is if the DA's office isn't going to be a partner in this whole system that where we're working to kind of stabilize and return to some form of normalcy, it's going to be extremely difficult, and I really think that it could have the potential of ramping things up.
Does it make you feel like the DA doesn't trust Portland police to make these arrests correctly?
No, I don't know. I don't know him. I don't really know much about him other than I've read his policy from today. I don't know if it's a trust issue. I think it's it's his policy. It's a policy issue. If he believes that that's the best way to address these things, then I'm a police sergeant. Who am I to say that he's wrong? I just can simply say that I believe, based on my experience, that I think it's dangerous, and I don't necessarily think that the people of Portland or the people in Multnomah County are going to. I was going to say benefit by it, but I think it could be detrimental to people, particularly those who live, work, and own businesses in these areas that are affected.
All right, so we gave District Attorney Mike Schmidt's office a heads up that we'd be airing that segment tonight, and quickly he sent us a statement. Quote, "We certainly appreciate Sergeant Maxey's years of service and experience. I value his opinions and the opinions of all of our local law enforcement. I look forward to continuing a productive dialogue regarding these issues." All right, I'm going to land this plane with one more viewer comment. Kind of. Basically, I posted this back and forth on Twitter, including that statement from the DA's office. Woodburn's police chief chimed in to back Sergeant Maxey. He wrote, "Well said," and then he tagged Mike Schmidt, Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler, City Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and Oregon Governor Kate Brown, writing they and others, quote, "created this mess by not taking a hard line on law and order, and that they needed to own this." Worth noting, Chief Herreras is also the president of the Oregon Association Chiefs of Police. So again, no shortage of opinions on this interview tonight. And one more time, I'm going to plug this. My entire interview with Sergeant Maxey, it's more than an hour long, is on YouTube right now. Check it out on the KGW channel. And while you're there, we genuinely hope you subscribe. All right, moving on once again. It's election season, in case you haven't heard, and that means a lot of campaign ads. They're back, and I'm sure you've seen some on TV for the presidential race and for local candidates. You might also see one for a man running for Congress, not in Oregon, but in Pennsylvania.
Good evening, Portland. I've heard you've been having a few issues. Something about peaceful gatherings, interruptions to business, and local citizens dissatisfied with your leadership.
I'm just going to talk.
I'm Jim Bognett, a candidate for Congress here in northeastern Pennsylvania. If you're a family or business living in Portland, Oregon, who is leaning toward leaving for whatever reason, consider Northeast PA. We're all about Made in America.
Wow. Okay, so yeah, Republican Jim Bognett, you just saw him there, bought airtime all the way across the country here in Portland to try and convince people sick of protests to move across the country to Pennsylvania, specifically northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm sure it's lovely. You saw the drone shot. To be clear, Bognett's campaign manager reportedly copped to the buy, adding that they weren't sure where their opponent, an incumbent congressman, would be, quote, flying on his private jet. So they took their chances and they bought ad time here. Zero sarcasm there, clearly. All right. Moving on tonight, so to tell us about your life outside your door, use the hashtag HeyDan or email the story at kgw.com. We're going to read some comments and some questions, some feedback basically, when we finish the story. Hey, welcome back, guys. So before we go, we want to share the story of a guy who's trying to make Portland a cleaner place, and he's using George Floyd's name to help him. Our photojournalist John Goodwin takes it from there.
There is still action at Ockley Green Middle School in North Portland.
With something like this, it's not where you start, it's if you start.
Just not in the classrooms.
There's a lot of chaos happening in 2020, so I think the best way to stand out and to also create a legacy is by doing things for people.
The learning that's happening here is from the ground up.
I'll be quite honest, I've never gardened a day in my life, ever.
With help from our street's PDX, 24-year-old Cheeto Marilay is hoping his latest project will grow into something beautiful.
The whole thing about Project Floyd is to just make as big of an impact in the community as possible.
And Cheeto is no stranger to this grassroots stuff. Back in May, he started Project Floyd, cleaning up trash downtown after nightly demonstrations.
If I'm going to be using somebody's name, at least make sure that the things that you're doing are good and just and transparent.
Here behind Ockley Green, his new goal is clearing out a forgotten community garden so the neighborhood can once again enjoy it.
Like the lock that we had to lock this place was also, giving us trouble too. So a lot of us had to slide through the crack in the fence and all that. I had to bust it off, and then I turn around and Portland police are actually behind me. Oh, hey, what's going on here? Oh, we're just gardening. So.
They've already filled these bags with what they've cleared out. Next is replacing the planter boxes and leveling this area to give folks a place to sit. Cheeto and a team of about 10 volunteers continue to chip away at a vision and something bigger.
When you hear George Floyd, you can think of, community outreach and good things, things that really help people, rather than, he was a man that was, unjustly slain.
It's not the recognition he looks for, it's his next project. If he can make our community a better place and inspire others to do the same, he's happy to have planted the seed.
So people know what you're doing, people believe and trust in what you're doing, and, in turn, that'll give you more energy to do more good things.
In North Portland, John Goodwin, KGW News.
All right, so I'm gonna move to my right a little bit, like the director said. I can follow directions. Here I go. Some of the comments coming in. I'm gonna start with one about the Lake Oswego story from Bryant earlier. Dustin said, I wholeheartedly disagree with the characterization that Lake Oswego is a racist and unwelcoming city. I've lived in West Lynn / Lake Oswego for 35 years, gone to school, church, what have you. In my experiences, the thousands of people I know in Lake Oswego, West Lynn, I don't know anyone who is not completely accepting and welcoming of people of color. Based on that comment, I'm wondering if you are yourself a person of color, and if not, I would ask you to ask a person of color about their experiences and do so in a way that lets them be really honest with you and then report back to us. That's what we did with that story, and that's what you heard from them. So if you want to have a conversation with them, you saw their name in the story, reach out to them. They're on social media. All right, read the Sergeant Maxey interview. And again, we've been getting so many comments on YouTube and on Twitter and on Facebook. So I'll read one more from Debbie. She said on Instagram, it showed me how out of touch the police are. I don't think they get the point. of Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to defend or advocate on behalf of either side here. We're just really about clarity and facts. In the interview, if you watch it on social media, or excuse me, on YouTube, Sergeant Maxey says that he understands the cause of Black Lives Matter and that he believes it was a legitimate cause when the protests, which he believes were protests, were happening. In his mind, it has devolved away from that. He views them as two separate things. Again, that is his take. I just want to make sure that's abundantly clear based on what he said. And again, one more for the millionth time, that interview is on YouTube. Please watch it in its entirety. That's why we put it up there, and subscribe while you're there. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching and for writing in. We really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us here on The Story, and the news with Laurel Porter at 6:30 is coming up next.